rook. Each player has two rooks, and they start in the corners of the board. A rook is often called a castle by beginner chess players, but the true and proper name is a rook. Rooks are the second most powerful pieces on the board, and their movement is extremely simple to understand. They can go up and down, or side to side, in any one direction as far as they desire. The next easiest piece to understand is the bishop. Each player also begins with two bishops, just like the rooks. But unlike the rooks, we forever will have a light square and a dark square bishop. Bishops are stuck to their respective starting diagonal for the rest of the game. They can move along these diagonals as far as they want in any one direction, one move at a time. However, they are never allowed to cross over to the other diagonal. Chess players often refer to the board as having a dark squared bishop or a light squared bishop. The next piece to learn is the queen. Her Majesty is by far the most powerful piece on the chessboard. She combines the powers of a rook and a bishop together. That means from a square like this, she might at one point move like a rook as far as she wants on the straight lines of the board, or in this case, like a light square bishop, reaching as far as she wants to the furthest corners and diagonals of the chessboard. She can move as far as her heart desires as long as she doesn't run into another piece and maintains the movements of a rook or a bishop. Now it's time to learn about the knight. Because of its equine appearance, a knight is often referred to as a horse by beginner chess players. But as a true chess player after watching this video, you will now refer to this noble steed by its proper name, the knight. A knight moves like a capital L in any one direction, 2 squares forward and 1 square to the side. Depending on the direction that it starts to, it stays moving 2 squares within that direction before completing the movement, as we can see, like a capital L to find its final square. A knight is also the only piece that can hop over another piece on the way to its final destination. In this example, we have a black pawn taking away the knight's route to the square b6 or b4. However, the knight is not actually prevented from going to this square. It hops right over the enemy piece. Often beginner players assume that because they hopped through this piece to their final square, that they can take this piece off the board. That is not the case. The knight is seen as bypassing any pieces on its route to its final square. You would, however, capture an enemy piece if that piece were on the final square you're moving to. Now it's time for us to talk about the little guys. The pawns may seem like the lowliest and shortest of your pieces, but they are actually the ones with the most potential and also the most numerous. Each player starts out with 8 pawns, respectively along the 2nd rank for white, 8 pawns, respectively along the 7th rank for black. A pawn can only move forward 1 square at a time, and never can a pawn move backward. However, what we'll learn about the pawn is that there are more exceptions to the movements of how to play with a pawn than all of the other pieces combined. For starters, on the first move only, pawns have the option to move 2 squares forward instead of just 1. Now, this is not an obligation. If one player chooses to move a pawn forward 2 squares, that does not mean the other player has to. You can choose at any time to move forward 1 or 2 squares. But again, a pawn only has the option to go 2 squares on its first move. From then on out, a pawn is stuck moving 1 square at a time. Speaking of exceptions of how to move the pawn, pawns are the only pieces that capture differently than they move. Here we have 2 pawns directly opposing each other along the e-file. These 2 pawns are not able to capture each other should they reach a deadlock in the middle of the board. Pawns only capture diagonally, also only 1 square in front of them. A pawn cannot capture a pawn directly in front of it. The special rules we have about our pawns continue. Pawns have a unique goal that no other piece has. If it reaches the other side of the board, a pawn has the ability to promote itself to any of the other pieces besides a second king. This is referred to as pawn promotion. Because a pawn does not have the ability to move backwards, if he completes the long journey, the pawn can replace itself with a new queen, or a second queen if you still have one, a rook, a bishop, or a knight. Often the end of the game is set up for the pawns to race each other to see who has the ability to get a new queen, the most common piece chosen, first. Our final rule about the very complicated pieces known as the pawns is called en passant. Pawns have a very special move, and it's a move that many even practiced chess players still confuse. The rule works like this. If one of the pawns has reached either the 5th rank for white or the 4th rank for black, this pawn is impinging on the other pawns who may try to move 2 squares directly by the pawn in front of it. Because this was not always the case, long ago pawns were not allowed to move 2 squares on their first move and were required to go 1 square, thus allowing a potential capture. When this rule changed, allowing pawns, if they choose, to move 2 squares directly by a pawn, the rule was also added en passant, which is French for in passing. In this position, if white tried to go 2 squares with a pawn right beside this pawn on the 4th rank, black would have the option, not the obligation, to capture this pawn en passant. This move only works because the pawn tried to move 2 squares directly by the pawn. If this pawn had moved 1 square, and white chose another random move that turn, we'll make one for an example, and only then moved to this square, you would no longer have the ability to capture en passant. The rule was only invented to prevent moving 2 squares directly by a pawn who has worked so hard to reach the 5th or the 4th rank, respectively. I have a fun rule I like to say to help my students remember this. If the pawns have ever faced off, that means you have to keep your hands off. So the fact that they had the ability to capture each other but chose not to means that there is no longer the ability to en passant. Again, it only works if a pawn tries to move 2 squares by a pawn that has been patiently waiting on the 5th or 4th rank. You did it. We've made it all the way to learning how the king moves. Kings are also complicated because to checkmate an enemy king is to win the game. But before we get to that, learning how the king moves is actually very easy. The king moves 1 square at a time in any direction it wants. Kings can only go 1 square, but they are actually the only other piece besides the queen that protects and attacks every square physically next to the current square that it stands on. The one trick about that is that kings are not allowed to go to a square if it is currently attacked by an enemy piece. Here's an example where the rook controls the entire e-file. So this king, while it can still go to d4, c4, c5, c6, and d6, the king cannot access e4, e5, or e6 at this moment, as that would put the king in check. What is check? I'm glad you asked. Check in chess is when a king has come under attack by an enemy piece. In this position, the white queen has several ways to put the black king in check. She can move like a rook up to the 6th rank, placing a direct attack on the king. Likewise, she can move like a rook to the 1st rank, delivering an attack along the f-file. Moving like a rook to b2 would also be delivering a check if you consider the queen's movement like a bishop along the dark square diagonal. Respectively, a1, as well as the squares f5 and g6 would all be moves that the queen could do to attack the enemy king in this position. When the king is in check, you should look for 3 ways to get out of it. Now that we've added the black rook, If the white queen were to move to the b2 square, black would actually have all three of these options at his disposal. The first way to get out of check, and often the most common one should look for, is can I capture the enemy piece that is attacking my king? In this position, black could actually move the rook from e2 to b2 and capture the piece that is attacking his leader. Often the second option you should look for when your king is under attack is if you can block the piece that's checking your king. In this case, the rook could also move backward to the square e5, which, by interposing the diagonal between the queen and the king, the rook has blocked the check to the king on f6. The third option to get out of check is simply to move the king to safety. Black could move the king to f5, g5, g6, f7, e7, or e6 to get out of check here. Note that neither g7, still in check, nor e5 get out of check. Those two squares would not be legal for the king to find safety. It's time to learn how a chess game is won. Checkmate is when a king is under fire, just as I showed in the last example, but none of the three options, to capture, block, or run away, is available to the king. This is called checkmate, and it ends the game immediately. In this position, black actually has several ways to deliver checkmate to the white king. The first and most common is what we refer to as a helper mate. The queen has placed herself directly in front of the white king. This king clearly cannot find safety on either of these two squares, as they are attacked by the enemy queen. But because this king helps the queen, the white king is also not allowed to capture. As we learned earlier, you can never place your king under check by an enemy piece, even if that piece is the enemy king himself. This is one example of a helper checkmate. The other example is on the square g2. Just like before, the king is attacked and he's trapped, with no ability to find safety, no ability to capture, and obviously no piece to block to protect. Three other examples of checkmate in this position are queen to c1, where just like a rook, the queen is delivering a check, and this king is unable to find safety on either of these squares, as they are both controlled and protected by the black king. Both b1 and a1 deliver checkmate in similar fashion. A very common source of confusion for beginner chess players is the difference between checkmate and stalemate. The difference between these two positions is that in the previous one, the king is under attack, directly opposed by the enemy black queen. In this position, while it is also one that white cannot find safety with any king move, as every one of those squares is under attack by black, it is not indeed checkmate because the king is not currently being attacked by an enemy black piece. Beginner players often make this mistake, remembering that a key part to checkmate is indeed to trap the enemy king. However, you must also be attacking this king in order for it to be checkmate, not just trapping him to where he has no legal moves. Checkmate wins the game for black in this position, whereas stalemate is a draw, meaning a half a point in the scorings for each player. You're almost there. We're this close to you playing your first chess game just after we learn how to set up the board. But before we do that, we have to learn about one more special move. It's the only move where you can move two pieces in one turn. Let's talk about castling. In the position you see before you, both white and black have their kings on what you'll learn is their starting position, along with each player possessing one rook in the corner. To illustrate the two different ways to castle, one to the short side of the board, meaning only two squares between the king and rook, and for black to the long side of the board, we have three squares between the king and the rook. We've set up both white and black with different starting positions. To castle, for white, moving two squares to g1, followed by the rook hopping over to the f1 square, is what a completed castled position looks like for the short side of the board for white. Moving to the long side of the board for black, the king would move to c8, and the rook would land on the d8 square. Castling, as said, is the only move where you can move two pieces at once, and you can only castle if both of those pieces have not yet moved at all from their original squares. Two final notes about castling before we set up the board and let you play. If a king is in check, he is not allowed to run to safety via castling. White would first have to deal with this bishop checking the king, assuming there were other pieces on the board to do so. Otherwise, he would have to move the king or block the check, and either way may lose his right to castle because the king would have to move away from its original square. Similarly, we look across to this side of the board, where even though the black king is not currently in check, in order to pass to the c8 square, you would have to cross over the d8 square, which is currently under the eyes of the gazing bishop on g5. Just as I said, black would have to have other pieces on the board to block that bishop, or in this case, try to block the diagonal, but either way would likely lose the right to castling if such a trade occurred. As the moment the king has moved and is no longer on its original square, you have lost the right to castle. We made it. It's time to set up the chessboard and get you playing. Before we add any pieces, however, take a good look at the board orientation. You'll note that both black and white start out with white squares on the right. For white, this is always h1. For black, this is always a8. Raise your right hand and make sure a white square is on the right before you start adding any pieces to the board. Next, we like to use the term tallest to smallest, adding both the kings and queens respectively for each army in the center of the board. You'll note that the white queen starts out on a white square, with the black queen starting out on a black square. This should always be the case with the kings starting out on the opposite color squares of their respective army. Next, I like to add the bishops next to the royal family. Keeping with the tallest to smallest approach, your bishops will almost always be the tallest pieces after the royal couple. Now we add our noble steeds. The knights start out respectively on g1 and b1 for white, and g8 and b8 for black. Finally, we add the towers of power. The rooks fill out the corners, making sure we will have the ability to castle with our king and rook as we just learned. Finally, it's time for us to add the little guys. As we've learned, the pawns are little in stature, but mighty in potential, and if a pawn reaches the other side of the board, promoting it will be a happy day for any chess player who manages to complete that long journey. Taking a good look one more time, you see the pieces on the 1st and 8th ranks respectively, with the pawns filling out the 2nd and 7th ranks for each player. You did it. We've set up the entire chessboard. You learned how the pieces move, as well as all the other special rules that make the Game of Kings so much fun. We'll see you around on chess.com.